The invitation came through text message at 9:47 a.m. on a Saturday, and Thomas Reed knew immediately that something was wrong. His mother-in-law, Margaret Patterson, didn't send casual text invitations. She either called with elaborate formality or sent engraved cards through the mail like it was still 1985. A text message that read, "Family gathering at the house today. 3 p.m. Your presence is expected," had ambush written all over it. Before we dive into this shocking story, subscribe to the channel so you're always first to know. Hit like if you're ready for the next revelation, and comment where you're watching from: New York, Los Angeles, maybe Chicago. All right, let's continue with Thomas as he prepares for whatever his in-laws have planned. Thomas showed the message to his wife Emily, who was making coffee in their modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens. She read it and her face went pale in a way that told Thomas she knew exactly what this was about and hadn't warned him. "Emily, what's this about?" His wife of 3 years wouldn't meet his eyes. "My family wants to talk to us. About our future. About some concerns they have." "What concerns?" "About your career. About whether you can actually provide for me the way they think I deserve." Emily's voice was small, ashamed. "Thomas, I didn't know they were planning this today. I swear. But they've been pressuring me for months to think about whether I made the right choice marrying you." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Emily's family, the Pattersons, had never liked him. They'd made that abundantly clear from the moment Emily brought him home 5 years ago. Thomas was a property manager for a real estate investment company, making a modest $68,000 a year. He wore off-the-rack suits, drove a 10-year-old Toyota, and had grown up solidly middle class in New Jersey. The Pattersons, by contrast, were old-money Connecticut aristocracy. Emily's father, Richard Patterson, was a fourth-generation investment banker. Her mother, Margaret, came from shipping fortune wealth. They lived in a sprawling estate in Greenwich that had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations, through charity galas that got written up in society pages, and had very clear ideas about who their daughter should have married. And it wasn't a property manager from New Jersey. "They want to humiliate me," Thomas said flatly. "That's what this is. They've gathered the whole family to stage some kind of intervention about how I'm not good enough for you." Emily's silence confirmed it. "I'm sorry. I've tried to tell them to back off, but you know how my mother gets. She thinks she's protecting me. By tearing down your husband, by making it clear I'm beneath you." Thomas felt anger rising. We've been married 3 years. At what point do they accept that you made your choice? They think you trapped me, that I was young and naive and didn't understand what marrying below my social class would mean long term." "Below your social class?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Is that what you think too?" "No. God, no, Thomas. I love you. I chose you. But my family," she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Thomas understood what she couldn't say. Emily loved him but was worn down by 3 years of her family's constant pressure, their snide comments about his career that wasn't really a career, their pointed questions about when he'd amount to something, their transparent disappointment that their daughter had married so far beneath her station. "I'm not going," Thomas said. "I'm not showing up to be their entertainment, to stand there while your parents and siblings and aunts and uncles all explain why I'm inadequate. If you don't go, it'll be worse. They'll say you're a coward. They'll pressure me even harder to reconsider our marriage." Emily grabbed his hands. "Please, just come. Get through it. Prove to them that you're strong enough to handle their disapproval." Thomas wanted to refuse. Every instinct told him this was a trap, that nothing good would come from walking into that house where the Pattersons could gang up on him on their own territory. But he looked at Emily's pleading face and made a decision he'd been considering for weeks now. It was time to end this. Not his marriage, he loved Emily genuinely, but the charade he'd been maintaining for 5 years about who he really was and what he really owned. "Fine, I'll go. But Emily, I need to tell you something first." What Thomas needed to tell Emily was that the sprawling Patterson estate in Greenwich, the house her family had lived in for 3 generations, the property her mother constantly referenced as proof of their superior breeding and taste, the home they were about to use as the setting for his humiliation, didn't actually belong to the Patterson family. Not anymore. It belonged to Thomas. The story began 4 years ago, right after Thomas and Emily had gotten engaged. Margaret Patterson had been particularly cruel about Thomas's financial prospects. making pointed comments about how Emily was sacrificing her birthright by marrying someone so beneath her station. She'd even suggested Thomas sign a prenuptial agreement waiving all claims to Patterson family assets, as if Thomas had been planning to gold dig his way into their fortune. Thomas had signed the prenup without argument, because what Margaret didn't know was that he had his own fortune that made the Patterson wealth look modest by comparison. Thomas Reed's grandfather had been a brilliant real estate investor who'd quietly assembled a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across New York and Connecticut starting in the 1960s. When he died, he'd left everything to his only grandson, Thomas, in a trust that became fully accessible when Thomas turned 25. The portfolio was worth approximately $180 million annually in rental income. Thomas had chosen to work as a property manager not because he needed the salary, but because he genuinely enjoyed the work and wanted to understand real estate from the ground up. He lived modestly because he'd seen how wealth corrupted people in relationships. And he'd never told Emily's family about his trust because he'd wanted to know they accepted him for who he was, not what he had. They'd failed that test spectacularly. The Patterson estate situation had developed 2 years into Thomas and Emily's marriage. Richard Patterson's investment bank had made catastrophically bad bets during a market downturn, leaving him personally liable for millions in losses. To avoid bankruptcy and public humiliation, he'd been forced to sell assets quietly, including the family estate that had supposedly been untouchable, held in a family trust for generations. The property had been listed discreetly through a private sale that never hit public markets. Thomas's real estate attorney had brought it to his attention as an investment opportunity. A prime Greenwich estate, 8 acres with a 12,000 square foot main house, guest house, pool, tennis courts, everything immaculate. The price was below market because the sellers needed speed and discretion. Thomas had bought it through one of his LLC holding companies, a transaction so buried in corporate entities and trust structures that the Pattersons never knew the identity of the buyer. The sale agreement had included a leaseback provision. The Pattersons could continue living in the house for a nominal rent of $1 per year for up to 5 years, giving them time to find alternative housing without the social embarrassment of being forced out of their family home. Richard Patterson had been grateful. He'd signed the agreement, taken the money to cover his debts, and told his family that he'd restructured the property ownership for tax purposes without admitting he'd actually sold it. Margaret and the rest of the family believed they still owned the estate, that it was still theirs by right of inheritance and breeding. They had no idea they were living in Thomas's house. Thomas had kept this information even from Emily, not out of malice, but because he'd wanted to see if she and her family would accept him without the influence of wealth. 2 years later, they'd shown conclusively that they couldn't. Now it was time to end the charade. Emily, you know how your father restructured the estate ownership 2 years ago. The tax thing, what about it? It wasn't a restructuring. He sold the property. And I'm the one who bought it. Emily stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. That's not possible. The house is still in the family. We're having the gathering there today. The house is being leased back to your parents for $1 a year until the agreement expires, which is in 3 months. Emily, I own your family's estate. I've owned it for 2 years. Your parents have been living in my house while your mother lectures me about my inadequate finances and career prospects. The color drained from Emily's face. You're serious? Completely. I have a $180 million real estate portfolio that I inherited from my grandfather. I work as a property manager because I enjoy it, not because I need the salary. I've kept this private because I wanted to see if your family could accept me for who I was rather than what I had. They've spent 5 years proving they can't. Thomas, this is why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted our relationship to be about us, not about money. But your family has made that impossible. They've spent 3 years trying to break us up, questioning whether you made a mistake, making sure you know I'm beneath you. Today they're gathering everyone to stage some kind of intervention to humiliate me into realizing I'm not good enough for you. I'm done pretending to be the inadequate husband they think I am. Emily sat down heavily on their couch. What are you going to do? I'm going to that gathering, and when your family is done explaining why I'm not good enough, I'm going to tell them exactly who owns the house they're standing in. Then I'm going to decide whether they're welcome to continue living there. Thomas, you can't do that. That's my family. Your family has spent 5 years treating me like garbage while living in my house. I've been patient. I've been understanding. I've tolerated their contempt because I love you and I thought eventually they'd accept me. But today they're gathering everyone specifically to humiliate me, and I'm done being their punching bag. Emily looked torn, clearly seeing both sides, loyalty to her family and recognition that they'd treated Thomas horribly, instead of in front of everyone. They're humiliating me in front of everyone. Why should I spare them the same treatment? Because you're better than they are. Because that's who you are, someone who doesn't need to prove their worth by throwing power around. Thomas felt the words hit home. Emily was right. Part of why he'd never revealed his wealth was because he didn't want to be the kind of person who used money as a weapon or measure of worth. But he was also exhausted from being treated like he wasn't good enough by people who were literally living in his house. Okay, we'll go. I'll let them have their intervention. But Emily, after today, your family needs to know the truth, all of it. Because I'm not spending the rest of our marriage being looked down on by people who owe their continued comfort to my generosity. They arrived at the Patterson estate, Thomas's estate, at 2:55 p.m. The circular driveway was full of expensive cars, Mercedes, BMW, Lexus, all belonging to various Patterson family members who'd come to witness Thomas's humiliation. The house looked magnificent in the afternoon sun, its white columns gleaming, the manicured lawns perfect, every detail screaming old money and establishment wealth. Margaret Patterson met them at the door, her smile cold and formal. Emily, darling. And, Thomas, how punctual. Everyone's waiting in the great room. Thomas followed Emily through the entrance hall, the one with the crystal chandelier he'd had restored last year at a cost of $45,000, and into the great room where approximately 20 Patterson family members were assembled. Emily's father, Richard, stood by the fireplace with the grave expression of someone about to chair a difficult board meeting. Her brother, Christopher, lounged in an armchair, looking smug. Her sister, Victoria, sat primly on the sofa, her banker husband beside her. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all arranged like a tribunal. Please, sit. Margaret gestured to two chairs positioned in the center of the room, clearly meant to be the hot seats. Thomas and Emily sat, and Thomas felt all eyes on him, measuring, judging, finding him wanting. Richard Patterson cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Emily, Thomas, thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, but the family felt it was important to have a frank conversation about your marriage and your future. By frank conversation, you mean tell me I'm not good enough for your daughter, Thomas said evenly. Richard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We want to ensure Emily is making choices that will provide her with the life she deserves. The life she was raised to expect, Thomas repeated. In this house, living with this standard of comfort and wealth. Exactly. Emily grew up with advantages, education, culture, social standing. She deserves a partner who can maintain that standard, who can move in the circles she was raised in. Richard's voice grew firmer. Thomas, you're a property manager. You make what, 60, 70,000 a year? You rent an apartment in Queens. You drive a 10-year-old car. How exactly do you plan to provide Emily with the life she deserves? I don't plan to provide it, Thomas said calmly. I plan to live within our means and build our life together based on what we actually need rather than what impresses your social circle. Margaret's voice was sharp. That's exactly the problem. You don't understand that Emily has needs beyond your middle-class notions of enough. She needs security, stability, a husband who can support her in the manner she's accustomed to. The manner she's accustomed to. Thomas looked around the room, at the antique furniture, the artwork, the marble fireplace, all the trappings of wealth that the Pattersons still believed they owned. You mean this house? This lifestyle? Among other things, yes. Margaret's tone made it clear she thought Thomas was being deliberately obtuse. Emily deserves someone who can provide a home like this, who can afford the lifestyle this family has maintained for generations. Someone like Victoria's husband Marcus, who's a partner at Goldman Sachs, Victoria interjected. Or like Christopher's fiancée Alexandra, whose father owns half of downtown Hartford. That's the kind of match we expected for Emily. Christopher leaned forward. No offense, Thomas, but you're punching way above your weight class. Emily could have had anyone. Trust fund guys, executives, entrepreneurs. Instead, she married a property manager who'll never amount to anything. You trapped her with romance and nice words, but what happens in 10 years when she realizes what she gave up? Thomas felt anger rising but kept his voice level. What she gave up? You mean the conditional love of a family who measures worth in bank accounts and social status? We measure worth in capability and ambition, Richard corrected. You've been at the same property management job for 5 years. No promotions, no advancement, no indication you're going anywhere. That's not ambition, Thomas. That's settling. And Emily deserves better than settling, Margaret added. Which is why we've asked you here today. We want to propose a solution that might benefit everyone. Thomas's stomach dropped. A solution. Richard pulled out a folder. We've had our attorneys draw up a post-nuptial agreement. Essentially, it would formalize the financial separation between you and Emily. She would maintain access to family resources and trust funds that we've been hesitant to include her in given her current marriage. You would acknowledge that you cannot provide the lifestyle she deserves and agree to certain limitations on your role in her life. Limitations. Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. You'd remain married, but with the understanding that you're not Emily's financial partner. You're her companion. The family would provide her living expenses, housing if needed, everything to maintain her standard of living. You'd continue your property management work and your finances would remain entirely separate. Thomas looked at Emily, whose face had gone white with mortification. Did you know about this? No. I swear I didn't know they were going to propose this. Emily, darling, don't be upset. Margaret's voice was soothing in the way that made Thomas's skin crawl. We're trying to help. We're trying to ensure you can have both the husband you want and the life you deserve. Thomas doesn't have to be inadequate. He just has to accept his limitations. Thomas stood up slowly, and something in his demeanor made the room go quiet. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You've gathered the entire family to tell me I'm not good enough for Emily. You've prepared a legal document that would formalize my status as her inadequate lower-class companion who needs to stay in his lane. And you're doing this here in this house because you think the setting reinforces your point about the lifestyle you've maintained for generations. That's a crude way to put it, but essentially yes, Richard said. And you think you have the right to make these demands because this house, this estate, represents everything I can never give Emily. This is your territory, your standard, your proof that I don't measure up. Exactly. Margaret looked pleased that Thomas was finally understanding. Thomas pulled out his phone and opened an app, then held it up to show the screen. This is the property management system for my real estate portfolio. These are the 247 properties I own across New York and Connecticut. Total portfolio value approximately $180 million. Annual rental income, about $12 million. The room went dead silent. This property, this house you're using to demonstrate my inadequacy, is property number 183 in my portfolio. I bought it 2 years ago when Richard needed to sell it to cover his investment losses. The buyer was one of my LLCs. The leaseback agreement that lets you continue living here expires in 3 months. Thomas watched Richard's face go from confused to horrified as he realized what this meant. That's not possible. The buyer was Clearwater Holdings LLC, which is owned by Harbor Trust Properties, which is owned by Reed Family Investments, which is controlled by me. I structured it with enough corporate layers that you'd never connect it to your son-in-law. But yes, Richard, you sold me this house, and Margaret, you've been living in my property for 2 years while lecturing me about my inadequate finances. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. This is some kind of joke. I have the deed and all sale documents in my car if you'd like to see them. I also have the leaseback agreement you signed, Richard, and records of the $1 annual rent payments you've been making to Clearwater Holdings. This house isn't yours. It hasn't been for 2 years. You're my tenants. Victoria's husband Marcus spoke up, his voice tight. If this is true, why hide it? Why let us think you were just a property manager? Because I wanted to see if you could accept me for who I was rather than what I had. 5 years I gave you to prove you could look beyond money and social status. 5 years you failed spectacularly. You spent that entire time treating me like I wasn't good enough, like I was some lower-class interloper who'd trapped Emily into marrying down. Thomas looked around the room at faces cycling through shock, disbelief, calculation, and horror. Every dinner where you made comments about my modest career, you were eating in my house. Every snide remark about my inability to provide properly for Emily, you were standing on property I own. Every concerned conversation about whether Emily made a mistake marrying me, you were living there because of my generosity in allowing you to lease back the house after Richard's financial disasters. Christopher found his voice. So what, you've been playing some kind of game? Testing us? That's sociopathic. No, it's strategic. I work in real estate investment specifically because I inherited my grandfather's portfolio and wanted to understand the business from the ground up. I live modestly because I've seen how wealth corrupts people and relationships. And I didn't tell Emily's family about my money because I wanted to know if you could accept me without it. You couldn't. You've spent 5 years proving that your love and acceptance are entirely contingent on bank accounts and social status. Thomas pulled out another document. This is the leaseback agreement. It expires September 30th. After that, you'll need to find alternative housing unless we negotiate a new lease at market rate, which for this property would be approximately $35,000 per month. Can you afford that, Richard? Or would you need your inadequate son-in-law to give you a discount? The silence was deafening. Emily's face was buried in her hands, clearly mortified. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Margaret's carefully maintained composure had completely cracked, leaving her looking old and shaken. Finally, Emily's Aunt Patricia spoke up. Thomas, I think we all owe you an apology. The family has treated you abominably based on assumptions that were completely wrong. Not wrong, Thomas corrected. Based on assumptions you never bothered to verify because you decided I wasn't worth knowing beyond my job title. Emily told you I was in real estate. None of you ever asked what that meant. You just assumed property manager meant I was barely scraping by, and you built 5 years of contempt on that assumption. What do you want from us? Margaret asked, her voice small. I want you to understand that the postnuptial agreement you are about to force on me, the one that would formalize my status as Emily's inadequate companion, that was the last straw. I've been patient. I've tolerated your contempt. I've tried to prove myself through character and love because those are what matter. But you've made it clear that nothing matters to you except money and status. So now you know, I have both in quantities that dwarf your family wealth. The question is whether you can treat me with respect now, or whether you only respect bank accounts. Richard stood, looking older than Thomas had ever seen him. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt of gratitude. When I needed to sell this property quietly, you bought it and gave us terms that saved our family from public humiliation. You've been paying to maintain the estate, handling all the property expenses, allowing us to continue living here, and we've repaid that generosity with nothing but contempt for you. Because you didn't know it was me. That doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. We should have treated you well regardless of who owned this house or how much money you made. Emily chose you. That should have been enough. Margaret was crying quietly, her perfect composure completely destroyed. I've been horrible to you. Absolutely horrible. And you just let me. You stood there and took it while owning the very house I was using as proof of your inadequacy. I did, because I kept hoping you'd eventually see beyond the surface. That you'd realize money and status don't determine someone's worth. But instead you planned this intervention, prepared legal documents to formalize my inadequacy, and gathered the whole family to make sure I understood I wasn't good enough. Thomas looked at Emily, who was watching him with tear-filled eyes. I'm done being your family's project, Emily. I love you. But we need to decide if we're building a life together or if you're always going to be torn between me and a family who fundamentally doesn't respect me. Emily stood up and took his hand. I choose you. I've always chosen you. I'm sorry it took me so long to see how badly my family was treating you. I'm sorry I let them pressure me, let them make me question our marriage. She turned to face her family. Thomas is right. All of you have spent 5 years treating him like he wasn't good enough, measuring his worth in job titles and social status. And now you know the truth. He's worth more than all of us combined, financially and in character. He could have told you from day one. He could have used his wealth to prove himself. But he didn't, because he wanted you to accept him for who he was. She looked at her parents. You owe Thomas more than an apology. You owe him a complete reset of how you think about worth and success. And if you can't do that, then Thomas and I will be building our life somewhere far away from your judgment. The family gathering ended with most of the Patterson family leaving in shocked silence. Richard and Margaret stayed behind, sitting in their living room, Thomas's living room, looking defeated. What happens now? Richard asked quietly. With the house, I mean. Thomas sat across from them, Emily beside him. The lease back expires in 3 months. You have 2 options: find another place to live, or negotiate a new lease with me at market rate, which we can't afford, Margaret said bitterly. Not after everything we've lost. No, probably not. Thomas paused. But there's a third option. I extend the lease back for another 5 years at the same $1 annual rate. With one condition: you treat me like family. Real family. Not someone you tolerate, not someone you measure and find wanting, but someone Emily chose and who deserves your respect regardless of his bank account. Richard and Margaret looked at each other, then back at Thomas. "Why would you do that?" Richard asked. "After how we've treated you? Because I love Emily and I know she loves her family despite everything. Because I have the resources to help and I believe people can change. And because I'd rather prove I'm a good person through actions than through revenge." Thomas leaned forward. "But understand this. If the contempt continues, if you go back to measuring my worth and status in social circles, the deal is off. I'll sell this property and you can figure out your housing on your own. My generosity has limits, and you've nearly exhausted them." "We'll do better," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise. We'll be better." Over the next year, the Patterson family gradually transformed in their treatment of Thomas. It wasn't instant. Years of ingrained snobbery didn't disappear overnight. But they made effort. Margaret stopped making comments about Thomas's career. Richard started asking substantive questions about real estate investment and actually listening to the answers. Christopher and Victoria became friendlier, less condescending. The biggest change came when Emily and Thomas bought their own house, a beautiful but modest home in Westchester that Thomas purchased through one of his companies. When the family came for housewarming, Margaret actually complimented the choice instead of suggesting something more appropriate to their status. "This is perfect for you two," she said, and sounded like she meant it, not too ostentatious, but beautiful and comfortable. "Very you, Thomas." 3 years after the disastrous family gathering, Emily was pregnant with their first child. The Patterson family threw a baby shower at the estate, the one they still lived in courtesy of Thomas's extended leaseback agreement. At one point, Thomas found Richard alone on the terrace. "I wanted to thank you," Richard said. "Not just for the house, though, that's been a remarkable gift, but for teaching me something important about how I measure people. I spent my whole career in finance surrounded by people who measured worth in dollars. I thought that's how everyone should be measured. You showed me how wrong that was. By hiding my wealth and letting you treat me badly, by having the confidence to be yourself regardless of what we thought, by not needing to prove your worth through money or status, by giving me the chance to learn these lessons even after I'd been a complete ass to you for years." Thomas smiled. "You've changed. All of you have. That's worth more than rent money. Still, when the baby comes, I want to help. Not because you need it, but because that's what family does. And you've taught me what family really means. Not people who share your social status, but people who show up and care and treat each other with respect regardless of bank accounts." The baby, a girl they named Claire, was born that winter. The Patterson family descended on the hospital with gifts and enthusiasm, treating Thomas like the valued son-in-law he'd always been, but they'd been too blind to see. Margaret held her granddaughter and cried, and for the first time Thomas believed those tears were about joy rather than regret. 5 years after the intervention, Thomas ran into Christopher at a charity event. Emily's brother, who'd been particularly cruel about Thomas's dead-end career, pulled him aside. "I've been wanting to say something for a while now, about that day at the house when we all tried to humiliate you. Ancient history," Thomas said. "Maybe for you, not for me. I think about it all the time. How smug I was, how certain I was that I was better than you because I worked in finance and drove a nice car and married well. And then finding out you owned the house we were standing in, that you were worth more than everyone in that room combined, that you'd been patient with our contempt when you could have destroyed us with a word." Christopher shook his head. "It changed me, Thomas. Made me realize I'd been measuring worth all wrong my whole life. That's good. Growth is good. I want you to know, if I ever have kids, I want them to know their Uncle Thomas. Not wealthy Thomas, just Thomas. The man who had the confidence to be himself regardless of what anyone thought. That's the role model they need, not some finance bro who thinks he's better than everyone." As Thomas drove home that night, he thought about the journey from that humiliating intervention to this place where Emily's family had genuinely learned to respect him. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, times when he'd wondered if the leopards would ever change their spots. But they had changed, at least mostly, and that change had come not from him revealing his wealth, though that had been the catalyst, but from him setting clear boundaries about respect and showing through his continued generosity that he was the kind of person worth respecting regardless of his bank account. The moral of this story is profound and multi-layered. It teaches us that people who measure worth solely in money and status are fundamentally shallow and will treat others with contempt based on wrong assumptions. The Patterson family spent 5 years being cruel to Thomas because they'd decided a property manager wasn't good enough, never bothering to verify their assumptions or consider that worth comes from character rather than career titles. We learn that hiding your wealth can be a powerful test of character, both yours and others. Thomas's decision to live modestly and not reveal his fortune allowed him to see exactly who the Pattersons were without the distorting influence of money. They failed that test badly, but the failure taught them valuable lessons they needed to learn. The story teaches us about the difference between revenge and boundaries. Thomas could have evicted the Pattersons immediately, could have humiliated them as thoroughly as they'd planned to humiliate him. Instead, he set clear boundaries, treat me with respect, or face consequences, while still offering grace through the extended leaseback agreement. That's maturity and wisdom, not weakness. We see that families who stage interventions to humiliate in-laws they dislike are toxic and need to be confronted. The Pattersons gathering everyone to present a post-nuptial agreement formalizing Thomas's inadequacy was psychological abuse, dressed up as family concern. That kind of behavior deserves to be called out and stopped. Most importantly, we learn that respect must be given regardless of perceived status or wealth. The Pattersons should have treated Thomas well because Emily chose him and because all people deserve basic respect. The fact that they only learned respect after discovering his wealth shows they still had growth ahead, but at least they recognized their failings and worked to change. Thank you for staying with this story. If it touched you, if it made you think about how you measure worth and treat people based on assumptions, please share it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden wealth, family dynamics, and the difference between respect earned through character versus fear earned through bank accounts. May you measure people by character rather than status. May you give respect based on humanity rather than wealth. May you recognize when families are toxic and set appropriate boundaries. And may you remember that the person you're looking down on might own the house you're standing in. Remember, when you gather everyone to humiliate someone based on assumptions about their inadequacy, make sure you actually know who owns the property you're using as proof of your superiority. The property manager might be the owner, and your contempt might be happening in his house.